This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with K-State Radio Network. K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre starts the show as she explains the likelihood of stripe, leaf, and stem rust in Kansas this year. The show continues with part of a Clearing the Air podcast episode from the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy as Jenny Ifft, Mark Edelman, and Scott Irwin discuss biofuels in the U.S. Raymond Cloyd, K-State horticultural entomologist, ends the show saying personal protection and eliminating breeding sites can help prepare for encounters with ticks, chiggers, and mosquitoes. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing wheat rust in Kansas with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kelsey, when we're thinking about wheat rust in Kansas, which rusts are we thinking about?
This is the time of year when we start to think about wheat rusts, right? We're coming out of green up now, out of dormancy, and this is the time we really start watching not only what's going on in Kansas, right, but what's going on in the states to our south. And it's also a time for us to just remember our different rusts and how they behave a little bit differently and look a little bit differently, right? So as a reminder, we have three main rusts in Kansas. So stripe rust, which has been our maybe most important rust over the last few years, right? That's the rust that looks like orange Cheeto dust in stripes on our wheat leaves, right? So if you run your finger along the leaf, it should come off on your fingers, turn them orange. It's very characteristic because it does form those stripes between the veins of leaves. Our second rust is leaf rust, right? So that's one that typically comes on a little bit later in the season. It prefers warmer weather than stripe rust, right? That's usually when we see it kind of migrate up from the south. And that one looks a little bit different, right? It has kind of these bright orange to brown spores that are kind of scattered across the leaf, right? And we put some pictures of this in the e-update too, just for reminders for everybody. The last one is stem rust. We talk about stem rust, we think about stem rust, but luckily for us, it is more rare in Kansas. And if it does come in, it comes in very late in the season, and it's really only a concern for susceptible varieties as of now. But the kind of key thing about stem rust is you can see the spores forming along the stem of the plant, and they are that darker brown color, right? So again, we have, these three major rusts in Kansas. They're usually pretty easy to tell apart visually, right? But they behave a little bit differently, right? They just have a little bit different temperature requirement. And so we do think about that when we're thinking about kind of gearing up that fungicide decision for the season.
At the beginning, you mentioned caring about what the states to our south are doing, and why is that something important for rusts in Kansas wheat?
These rusts typically don't survive the winter here in Kansas, right? So they work their way up from the south, either from places in southern Texas or even in Mexico where they survive the winter, and they have to work their way up again every year, right? So we can usually kind of see them coming, right? So we'll see the pressure in Texas in February. We'll see the pressure in Oklahoma this time of year. And that gives us a pretty good indicator of what we're going to expect here in Kansas and even going up north. So this year, the other maybe interesting piece, if you remember, we did have some leaf rust that was pretty bad here in the fall, right? So that's one thing that makes this season a little bit different. We had leaf rust that was very active in the fall in susceptible varieties, right? And that was something that we've been watching pretty closely, right? So the risk there, and it's a small risk, is that in those fields, most of that leaf rust should have died, but there's a small chance that it, survived under snow cover or a really thick canopy. It survived those very cold temperatures we had over the winter. And there's a chance it can kind of kick off again from those fields, right? So if you had leaf rust active in your field in the fall, those are important fields to start scouting again this spring, right? If it died off, no problem. But if it starts to get going again, especially if we have some wetter weather this weekend, that would be the time to maybe start thinking about a fungicide application for those fields that had that fall pressure. So just a friendly reminder to get out and check those fields, especially if you notice that leaf rust pressure. Maybe the other piece of that, Shelby, is that we usually check, like I mentioned, what's going on in the south. So this year, leaf rust has been the more active rust in wheat in Texas, right? So stripe rust has been at very low levels, but leaf rust is the one that's actually been more active and affecting more acres there. And there's just been a little bit reported in Oklahoma in early January, right? So the pressure as of right now is low, right? The pressure coming in from the south. But if we do have some wet weather kind of take off here through the middle of April, we might start to see leaf rust actually pick up this year. And it seems like leaf rust will potentially be a higher risk for our crop than stripe rust this year, which will be different than the last few years.
And what impact does leaf rust have on the crop?
So leaf rust can result in pretty good yield damage, unfortunately, right? So if you are seeing, 5% of your field affected with leaf rust, that might be a good time to think about a fungicide application because we can see, that 20% yield loss in years that leaf rust does take off. I'll say an important thing to just double check is your variety rating. So varieties will have different resistance for leaf rust and for stripe rust. So for example, KS Providence, which is a popular variety, I'll just use that as an example here in Kansas. It's a notch more susceptible for stripe rust, but it does have better resistance to leaf rust, right? So if you've got KS Providence out, you probably have less of a risk. So this is just the time too to go in and double check those stripe rust, leaf rust ratings in your Kansas wheat variety guide. And that should help kind of inform our fungicide decision, right? And just remember those are different ratings and kind of different behaviors of the varieties.
You'd mentioned that stripe rust had per se been the more popular rust in the past few years. And so why is it maybe taking a little bit of a back seat this year?
Popular, yeah. It's hard to say if it was actually popular, right? Maybe popular, unfortunately. So stripe rust, has been the bigger issue. It's the one we've seen in past years kind of kick off first there in Texas. Now, interestingly, the conditions just weren't very good for stripe rust in Texas over the winter, right? So K-State looks at the weather in Texas to kind of predict how bad it's going to be. So, really the weather conditions just weren't quite right for stripe rust to survive the winter in Texas. And that kind of cascades, right? So leaf rust was the more predominant rust there in Texas. They haven't had much stripe rust. We haven't seen stripe rust reported in Oklahoma. So again, we're kind of gearing up for what seems like a lower stripe rust year here in Kansas, which is a good thing, right? I will say though, we've got a lot of season left, right? So it's always a reminder that we just need to get out and scout. Let us know if you do find these rusts and we'll put out updates as they start to come into the state and get more active here through April. But again, this is the time to really scout so we can get ahead of any, fungicide applications that need to be made as we enter those critical phases of growth, which would be kind of after that flag leaf emerges.
And our last rust to talk about for today, stem rust. And is that something you think we might see in Kansas this year?
So the indicators are, we're not seeing stem rust to our south, right, from all the reports we've gotten. So I think we'll have another year where we're in the clear for stem rust. But again, there are a few varieties, and this comes back to just always checking your variety ratings. There are a few varieties that are more susceptible that are out in Kansas, and it's always good to scout those towards the end of the season. But if the last few years give us any indication, if stem rust does come on, we suspect it'll come on kind of too late to cause yield damage in a year like this. So it's one to look out for sure, but everything now indicates that it won't be a bad stem rust year.
Can a wheat field have multiple rusts in it at the same time?
Well, it sure can. And a couple years ago, I think it was 2024, we had, stripe rust come on later in the season, but it still did cause some damage, especially in south central Kansas. And pretty much leaf rust then came on and took any of the leaf that was left in that south central part of the state, right? So again, leaf rust likes warmer weather, right? Warmer wet weather. Stripe rust likes cooler wet weather. So often we kind of see stripe rust come on, then we'll see leaf rust come in, but they can be active at the same time.
How quickly do you see a wheat crop go from not showing any signs of rust to maybe having that cooler weather and then showing signs of stripe rust?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So usually you can see stripe rust or leaf rust building up, right? So occasionally we can see a lot of leaves that seem to be affected at the same time, but usually you can see it build up. And all of that is really dependent on the weather. So if we have really, cool, wet weather, and we have a lot of spores coming in from the south, things can build up quickly, right? So that's kind of our risk. Good weather and a lot of spores coming from the south. In a year like this, when we have, maybe we'll have a little bit of wet weather this weekend, hopefully, but we have less spores that are kind of coming in from the south, it's going to take a little longer for the disease to establish and get going, right? So, you do have time to get out, scout the field, and make an application before we get to kind of critical levels, or we get to the case where we're losing flag leaves or having really bad infections on our flag leaves.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Great. Well, thanks again for having me.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. I will link her Agronomy E-Update article titled Wheat Rust Outlook and Reminders for the 2026 season in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of a Clearing the Air podcast episode, which is a collaboration between the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy and the Smoke and Mirrors podcast. Today on the episode, you can hear from K-State's Eric Atkinson and Jenny Ifft, Iowa State University's Mark Edelman, and the University of Nebraska's Brad Lubin, along with their special guest, Scott Irwin from the University of Illinois. In this portion of the segment that I have put in Agriculture Today's show, you will only be hearing from Jenny Ifft, Mark Edelman, and that special guest, Scott Irwin.
If the demand for if this continues to grow, and I think this covers a lot of your research, are we going to see energy and agricultural commodity markets become even more linked? Are you worried about how prices are formed, volatility with that?
It clearly does link the fortunes of U.S. Corn Belt agriculture more closely to what's going on in broader fossil fuels market. There's no doubt about that, but it's not always negative in the ways you might think. For example, today with crude oil taking off to the territory of $100 a barrel, that makes biofuels in general, and especially ethanol and the role that it plays as kind of a dampener of these kind of spikes, really begins to resonate and be salient. Right now, the U.S. is producing about 1.5 million barrels of biofuels a day. And I think the U.S. uses something like 12 to 15 million barrels a day. So it's a significant contribution to the overall supply. And, when the world is flush with crude oil, that's not as important. But right now, it is a relevant point to make. How much worse would the price spike be in the U.S. without those 1.5 million barrels? I mean, we can argue about it, and people do constantly about the magnitude of those kind of price dampening effects, but they're real. I think that it's so, in other words, high crude oil prices are not necessarily bad for biofuels and therefore bad for Corn Belt agriculture. Some parts of it are, and it does raise some production costs and on that side of the enterprise budget. But there's also some very positive impacts. So, you have to be really careful in just making broad statements about this linkage and how it hurts and how it helps. It's a little more subtle than I think people may realize. And I think we are now tied to that continuing in the long run. I don't see that changing. So this is where we are.
If we could talk a little bit about the downsides. So when, oil prices are high, ethanol is an important source of supply, and that can get transmitted to agricultural commodity prices. I guess the inverse is when oil prices are low. What are the downsides of that? Or volatile?
Well, and it's, again, kind of tricky in that on the ethanol side, because ethanol basically is now driven by basically the economics of fossil fuels. It's just now part of the gang. And so if refiners and crude oil refiners, gasoline manufacturers, and ethanol plants are producing a lot and the prices are high, their fortunes tend to rise and fall together now. But that's not true on the biomass-based diesel side. It has to be forced into the market, and it largely is cushioned from the volatility in the fossil fuel markets. So again, kind of a division. You have to really think differently about corn ethanol versus, say, soybean oil biodiesel and how the entire market economics work.
What do you think are the most misunderstood things about biofuels and agricultural markets that you've encountered?
Well, I'd say the number one is quite easily and most controversial is the role of ethanol. That bombarded with policy research coming out of parts of the ag econ profession, but particularly out of environmental economics and the climate community that says, corn ethanol is evil. And it's a huge negative in terms of increases in production. And I'm not saying that there aren't some follow-on environmental issues that are important, but again, easily the number one misconception is related to the blending value of ethanol due to its octane contribution. You go look at any peer-reviewed research that comes out of environmental economics and climate literature, none of it, as far as I know, or extremely few papers incorporate that value for ethanol. And so the common argument is that ethanol clearly does have only 2/3 of the energy value. In other words, a gallon of ethanol will only get you 2/3 as far as a gallon of pure E0 gasoline. That's absolutely true. And so you'll see this is a bad deal for American consumers because they're getting taken advantage of by forcing to use a much less energy efficient component in the gasoline blend with no offsetting advantages. You've got all these other kinds of environmental issues associated with increased corn production, and therefore this is easily a bad deal. I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but that's basically the position of environmental and climate change community from scientists down to advocates. And they're just wrong. That you go inside the refining industry and you find anybody that knows what they're talking about understands the entire system has adjusted to the octane value that ethanol contains. And here's my simplest way to illustrate the point. Whenever we have large spikes in the price of corn now, there will inevitably be proposals from someplace, typically coming out of the environmental climate area. The way to solve the price spike is to waive the RFS mandates for corn ethanol. Every time I have to push back against them and say, you don't understand the economics of gasoline blending in the United States, because you can remove the mandates all you want. We're not going to use 1 gallon less ethanol because of its octane value.
Let me ask sort of a rhetorical question, because as we look at corn ethanol, and there are there's Amber Waves of Grain in Kansas, I know, which tries to utilize some wheat in the biofuels ethanol business. But where would we be in the Corn Belt and the Midwest if we didn't have the ethanol industry there? Because half our corn goes into ethanol.
Again, a very interesting question, Mark. The way to frame that is the price of corn from the mid-'70s until 2006 in the U.S. Corn Belt averaged about $2.40 a bushel. Since the ethanol boom really started in the early 2000s, so for the last 18 years, the price of corn in the Midwest has averaged about $4.50. Now, not 100% of that can be attributed to corn ethanol, and ag economists have still not settled as a profession what proportion does it deserve. Basically, the only really two big changes that could explain that is a combination of the ethanol boom and the continued dramatic growth until very recently in Chinese soybean export demand. It's a little hard to tease that out, but I'm very confident of that change in the price of corn. At least half of it, probably I would put around 2/3 of it is probably due to the ethanol boom. Without it, we would have a hard time average prices ever getting above, say, 350, 3.25, 350. Very different world, very different land prices, very different asset values.
And aren't we doing this level of production pretty much with the same or less crop acreage than what we had 26 years ago? Or so.
Yeah, exactly. Total amount of corn and soybean acreage in the U.S. changed very little in the last 25 years. While, we've been able to do this without even greater price pressure because of the continuous growth in productivity per acre. I mean, we have been bumping along now for nearly 70 years since the late 1950s. What I worry about, Mark, more than plateauing, I think the evidence is due to continued genetic improvement, management improvements, et cetera, that we've probably ticked up that rate going to the forward, which makes me a little concerned about surpluses. And the evidence on soybeans in the last 10 years is very unequivocal that we've seen, due to a combination of management and genetics, that soybean yields have definitely gone on a nonlinear upward trend. And so that it's a critical perspective on the whole biofuels arguments is what do you believe about trend yields? Not only here in the U.S., obviously it matters in Brazil. Another big cushion on the biomass-based diesel side, Mark, is the enormous increases in soybean production in Brazil, and they've pretty much caught up with U.S. yields. So if you ask me, despite all these positive things about biofuels that I've been talking about, they're there and they're real, a nagging worry I have is not deficits in the next 10 years, but surpluses because of rising acreage in South America and ticking up of the rate of growth in trend yields for corn and soybeans. This is the one that I'm really kind of queasy about.
Once again, that was Clearing the Air podcast episode from the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy for March 2026. If you'd like to hear the full episode, I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Now is the time to prepare for potential encounters with ticks, chiggers, and mosquitoes. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd says that includes personal protection when you're outdoors and reducing potential breeding sites around the home. Raymond, really not a lot of insects to cover right now, but let's talk about some things that we may be seeing at some point. I know actually ticks are somewhat of an issue right now.
Ticks are going to potentially be an issue because with the unmanaged vegetation, things coming out, and this April through November is, I would say, typically the tick season. People need to be aware of ticks. A couple of pointers is if you're going to be going outside more as the weather warms up and you stay on the trails, don't wander off into unmanaged areas because that's where ticks are most likely to be there. It's a favorable environment. They don't like high temperatures, low humidity, so that's why you mow these areas if you can. Also wear repellents, DEET, picaridin, IR 3535, permethrin you can apply to your clothing but not your skin. So there are these repellents. And then when you come in, take a shower because that'll remove the sea ticks, and just check yourself over, okay? Because you know that ticks, there's over 800 species, vector more diseases than mosquitoes do. And of course, everybody has heard of the Lone Star tick and the alpha-gal syndrome. That information's out there. But you want to take these biting arthropods seriously. Not just ticks, but chiggers and mosquitoes and others that are out there. And then when you do remove a tick, do not throw it away. Send it to Kansas State University Entomology Department to get identified, to figure out what potential pathogen that you may be susceptible to. Of course, Lone Star tick is affiliated with the meat allergy. Then we have the American dog tick, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then we have the deer tick, black-legged tick, which is the vector of Lyme disease. And some of these ticks not only have one pathogen, but they can have several out there. So be very cognizant when you're outdoors. Tuck your pants in with your socks so you can see them. And there's an extension publication that's out there that you can download and get more information about ticks and then protecting yourself. They're not really biting you, they're feeding on you, from being fed upon by a tick.
You mentioned chiggers and mosquitoes. That's another thing we'll see here shortly.
Yes. Again, as the temperature warms up, we start seeing more unmanaged vegetation. We'll see more chigger outbreaks, and we have an extension publication on chiggers. And then if we get rain or moisture, then we have to be cognizant of mosquitoes. And we have extension publication on that. But I think the way to protect yourself from all three of them is stay in the trails where a protective repellent, like I mentioned, DEET and others that are out there. When you come inside, take your clothing off. You can put it in the dryer at the highest temperature and then take a shower to ward off chiggers and ticks. And then for mosquitoes, just don't be out there in dawn and dusk when they're mostly active. And, of course, the main one is remove all sources of stagnant water, because that's where most of your species of mosquitoes breed, like wheelbarrows, old tires, bird baths, things like that.
One other thing to cover, clover mites. What should we know about that?
Clover mites are another mite. They're not a biting mite. They're a nuisance mite, and they come in the house, and we have an extension publication on that one too. And this is the time of year they'll start moving in, and they move back and forth, inside and outside. One of the they don't bite, but they're very fast-moving mites with the front legs are really extended and long, and they're deep red, and you don't want to squish them because they leave a red stain. But one of the ways to minimize, and I'm saying minimize with quotes, is to keep your turf grass away from your foundation. Don't overwater it, don't over-fertilize it. And then if you don't want turf grass, you can put a gravel barrier between the foundation and the turf grass. And in a number of cases with clients, that has helped some. And then you might have to spray from the foundation about, a foot or 2 feet, and then 3 or 4 feet out from there with some type of insecticide or miticide to kill or repel them. If they do start coming in, you can put double-sided sticky tape along the windows where they're coming in, and that will trap them. But they do overwinter in the home, and then they'll move back and forth several times during their different life stages, moving outside and moving back inside. But if you do have any questions regarding any ticks, chiggers, mosquitoes, clover mites, contact our Department of Entomology office, and they will put you in touch with somebody that will be there to help you.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with information on ticks, chiggers, mosquitoes, and clover mites. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.